Hi guys, it's Ellen Brock, novel editor. I hope you're all doing really well. Today I want to start a new series on story structure. So in my old series on story structure, the focus was more on the major plot points, and I do want to touch on the major plot points in this series, but I want to primarily talk about everything that sort of goes in between those plot points and how those things connect together and relate to each other. So I've noticed a lot of writers really struggling with understanding how to get to the plot points or what should happen between the plot points. But also in this series, I want to talk about just construction in general, why certain choices might be made for a story and how that sort of impacts the reader or the viewer, if the case is film, their experience of the story, sort of what they get out of it, and sort of why elements are balanced in a certain way or handled in a certain way. So today what we're going to be talking about is the status quo specifically. So the status quo is the very early, most basic setup for the characters, the world, and things like that. We're really just looking to establish what's going on before the status quo inevitably gets disrupted. I do want to start by saying that I'm going to be using films primarily as the example for this video, but also throughout the series. Not because I don't love novels or enjoy talking about novels, but because it's a lot harder to come up with examples from novels that everybody is really familiar with. It's much easier to come up with films that most of us have seen that we can talk about and sort of examine and dissect for the purpose of this series. So I'm mostly going to be talking about films, but these tips and things are for novels as well. It's not because I'm talking about film structure as a separate thing from novel structure. It's just because I'm trying to find an easy example that we can all understand. So that's why I'll be using films primarily as the examples for this series. So to start, I want to talk about a few definitions, mainly because there can be some confusion about this. The catalyst and the inciting incident are sometimes used interchangeably. So in some structural systems, those two words refer to the same thing. In other structural systems, the inciting incident refers more to the call to action, which isn't necessarily the same thing as the catalyst, but again, it depends a lot on who you ask or what structural systems you follow. The main thing that I just want to make clear in this video is that I'm talking about the status quo as the period of time before the start of the disruption, before the very first disruption occurs, and I'm referring to the disruption of the status quo as that very first thing that disrupts the status quo. I'm not going to use the term catalyst, or I'm going to try to not use the term catalyst and inciting incident because I don't want to create confusion, because those things sometimes are used to refer to other moments in the first quarter of the novel. So I will talk about this a lot more in the next video. In this video, I'm mostly talking about the status quo, but just so that we can define what we're talking about, that's why I'm not using the term catalyst or inciting incident in this video. I just want to try to minimize confusion because I think that plot structure can be really difficult to understand, and some of that confusion I think can come from terms being used interchangeably or used to refer to different things by different people. So today we're talking about the status quo and the disruption of the status quo, and that's basically the terminology that I'm going to be using throughout this video. So now that we have that explained, hopefully I didn't just make it more confusing, let's talk about the status quo. So the status quo, it can sound like what we're saying is set up the character in their most ordinary possible situation, in the most ordinary world possible, just a very basic, uninteresting introduction. But we actually don't see that play out in books or films at all. We very, very seldom see a character introduced in a normal, mundane, everyday kind of situation. We normally see them introduced in a situation that is sort of within the realm of what's normal for them, but isn't really just a normal, regular, everyday kind of situation, even for that character. So it's normally a situation that's a little bit worse than usual, or harder than usual, more stressful than usual. And that's mainly because it would be really boring to meet a character in just the most mundane, basic, everyday situation. So, for example, in the Hunger Games, we meet Katniss within the realm of what's normal for her, her regular, ordinary life. But we meet her on a day when the names are going to be pulled for the Hunger Games, which is an unusually stressful and tense day. So it's not just a regular day of her going out and hunting for her family. We meet her on a much more unusually stressful day. Toy Story is another good example of this. We meet Woody on the day that Andy's having his birthday party, so new toys are going to be introduced, and that's a higher stress, higher risk sort of day, but it's still within the realm of what's normal. It's just not mundane. We don't meet Woody just on a regular day playing games with Andy. We meet him on a more interesting and dynamic day. And of course, that's part of establishing an opening hook, is that you don't want to open with something that's just completely boring and uninteresting and ordinary. Usually then we see that the disruption of the status quo makes the day even worse. That's a very, very common setup. So the day starts very stressful and tense. Then that leads into the disruption of the status quo, which makes things even worse than before. So Buzz is introduced and he's really cool and exciting, and that makes Woody's day even worse and more stressful. So we also in that we see Woody's expectation for that tense day wasn't really negative. He didn't really anticipate something this bad happening. So even though it's a worse than normal day, that doesn't mean that the character has to expect things to turn out negatively. And in fact, the disruption of the status quo being something that's not expected is a very strong element of story construction. So you will almost always see the status quo disruption being something that the character didn't expect to happen. So that we see there, and we also see the day's a little bit more stressful than usual. And then when that disruption happens, it becomes much more stressful than it already was. Similar with Katniss in the Hunger Games, we see her day getting even more stressful, a lot more stressful when Prim's name is pulled for the Hunger Games. So we see an intense escalation of events. The disruption, though unexpected, it doesn't necessarily have to be bad. A good example of this is in Gremlins. We meet Billy, the protagonist, and he, again, is having a really bad day. He's at his job, his normal everyday job at the bank, but it's going a lot worse than usual. He almost gets fired. Someone yells at him. It's a really bad day. But then when he gets home, his dad gives him the little gremlin Gizmo, and that actually makes his day better. So it's unexpected, but it wasn't a negative worsening of his situation. It actually improved his day. So keep in mind that it's unexpected, but it doesn't have to be negative. It's not inherently right out of the gate a problem. It will eventually lead to problems, but it's not immediately a problem necessarily. There will sometimes be situations where we are introduced to a character in a very boring, mundane setting, but typically in that case, that's the point. That's the reason that it's introduced in that way, is to create a contrast to how disrupted and unusual their life becomes once the status quo is disrupted. A good example of that is E.T. We meet Elliot in a really normal, everyday situation where he's sort of being bullied by his brothers, but it doesn't really go beyond what's normal or what's easily understood by the viewer. So it's not an unusual situation that requires a long setup. It's very easy to understand and simple. And in that case, the mundaneness also helps to emphasize how unusual it is when he finds an alien in his shed. The other thing to keep in mind is that in that situation, the mundane setup is very, very short. It's less than one scene. We see him sort of fighting with his brothers a little bit. He goes out to the shed, hears a noise, and that's what introduces, E.T. comes into the story shortly after that. So if you're going to start with a very mundane setup, that setup is then going to be very, very short. We also see a similar sort of situation in Hitchhiker's Guide. It starts very mundane, but again, that's the point, is to sort of contrast the mundane elements of Arthur Dent's life with how outrageous and bizarre things become as the story progresses. So it is possible to use a mundane setup or a mundane status quo, but there's a reason for why that's used. One element that can be a little bit confusing for writers when they're looking at the status quo of books or films is that you might notice a very common setup or very early beginning setup to stories is that the characters are already going through a transition. So they've already had a major life change and now they're adjusting to their new life. So it doesn't really look like a status quo. It looks like we never really saw them in their status quo at all. Haunted house stories very often fall into this category. The Conjuring, Insidious, Amityville Horror, things like that all start with moving into a new house. We don't see the characters in their old house. We don't see their old way of life. We only see them in the process of moving or on the day they moved or shortly after moving. Teen movies or family movies often follow this format as well, with the kids starting in a new school, and we don't really see them in their old school. Often we don't see any glimpses at all of their old life. And so we're not meeting them in what would generally be considered a status quo kind of situation or day. Some examples of this sort of opening with a transition would be Mean Girls, where we see her adjusting to life. We see Katie adjusting to life in Illinois, I believe, having previously been in Africa. We also see this kind of teen setup in Hocus Pocus, with Max adjusting to his life in Salem, having previously lived in LA. Even though in this case the characters are already going through a transition and it seems like their status quo is already disrupted, what we're really experiencing is their attempt to establish a new status quo. So they're trying to sort of find a way to make things work, more or less. Things are not that set in stone when it comes to these construction elements, so I don't want anyone to feel like what I'm saying is everything has to be this way or fall exactly into this category. So, for example, with Max in Hocus Pocus, he's kind of resistant to living there. You could make the argument maybe he's kind of trying to make the best of it, but he's getting bullied. He doesn't really have a super great attitude about the new town. So it doesn't have to be that the character is making a really admirable attempt to establish a status quo. There may be some resistance and some negativity and things involved in that, and that's completely fine. However, the important thing is less that they're trying to establish the status quo. They may or may, as we've discussed, they may or may not be trying to do that. But the more important element is their expectation of their new status quo. So in Hocus Pocus, Max expects his status quo to be negative. He doesn't have good expectations for this town. He does not like it. He doesn't want to be there. His expectations are negative. So interestingly, his disruption of the status quo is when he meets Allison, which becomes his love interest, which is a positive thing. It's a good thing that happens to him. It gives him sort of a sense of, maybe there's something to like about this town. Maybe everything isn't going to be completely horrible. And that violates his expectation, which was that everything would go negatively. So in those transition type setups, you're still looking for what's unexpected or what violates expectations, but we're not really starting with what would be considered a status quo in the traditional sense. In your sort of classic haunted house story, for example, in Insidious, we see the characters attempting to sort of adjust to their new life. Again, there may be mixed expectations of what that's going to be like. It might be positive, it might be negative. In the case of Insidious, the wife, the mother, I'm not sure what the character's name is, the character played by Rose Byrne, she's attempting to sort of reignite her musical career. She's sort of looking for more peace in her life. And the expectation was that this would be a positive experience, but her son, Dalton, has an accident, hits his head, falls into a coma, which is very negative. It goes against the expectation. Instead of finding peace in this house, in this new life, she's finding things are really stressful and way worse than before. So look for that violation of expectations, even though sometimes the status quo isn't really what the character is used to. It's still important, typically, not always, but typically, that you establish something about what their life was previously like, really just to provide context for what's different about this transition they're going through or this new status quo. Usually that would be done through either introspection or dialogue, so the character sort of thinking about the contrasts of this life with their old life. So they might think or say, my old room was bigger than this room, or my old school, the kids were cooler than in this school. And the only way that we sort of learn about that previous status quo is through those sort of comparison thoughts, or comparison dialogue, sort of comparing and contrasting the current new situation with the old situation. So you could probably tell from these examples that the length of the status quo section of a novel or a film, it's variable. It's sometimes very short, sometimes seconds long in films and books. Honestly, sometimes only a few sentences long. Other times it can take up a really significant amount of time. It can take up many chapters and scenes. And so there's a very wide range that you can sort of construct your story within. This can then, of course, create other concerns and confusion about how you determine how long that section should be and how you decide how you're going to handle it. So that's really the core of what I want to be able to talk about in this series as a whole, is how do you make those decisions and sort of how do you handle it. So the variable length depends on a couple of factors. So how long you linger in the status quo is going to depend on the uniqueness of the status quo that you need to establish, as well as how well you can create compelling scenes within the status quo. Those are really the two big factors that you want to look out for. So a longer status quo makes sense for certain things, certain scenarios that are really hard to understand. So for example, in the Hunger Games, it makes sense to have a longer status quo, a longer amount of time before there's that disruption, because we need to learn a lot about Katniss's situation, her family, her friends, her relationships to other people. But primarily the length of the status quo is essential to setting up the setting, the dystopian world, and giving us a good sense of how that works and what that's like, so that we really understand when that disruption happens and Prim's name is pulled for the Hunger Games, we really understand what that means and the significance of that. So it's really not a good candidate for an early disruption of the status quo, because if we were to learn, in the very first scene that her sister was pulled, it's not impossible to make that work. It wouldn't have been outside the realm of possibility, but it would have been really difficult to give the reader enough information without info dumping or relying on, long bouts of dialogue so characters could discuss what was occurring to fill us all in on the things that we missed. So it makes sense to just allow more space and time to establish the world and the setup. On the other side of that, we have, for example, E.T., like we talked about before. There's only so much to say about a little boy living in suburbia. We, for the most part, get what that means, and we don't really need to linger in order to understand that. Elliot in E.T. is also sort of like an everyman. I guess he's like an every boy or an every kid. And so lingering too long on the setup in that case can also differentiate him more from the average person. And that isn't necessarily a good thing for what you want to accomplish in a more, in a simpler storyline. A simple sort of, monster shows up, and what do you do and what do you respond in this unusual situation? How do you handle that? It's more something you want everybody to be able to relate to. So in that case, it doesn't necessarily make sense to add a lot of elements and conflicts and things like that to the status quo. And that leads into the next point, which I mentioned previous, which is that the ability to create compelling conflicts is an important factor in how long you should linger in the status quo. If a book really doesn't lend itself to compelling conflicts before the status quo is disrupted, it's not going to be a good candidate for a late disruption of the status quo. So, for example, in a haunted house movie, how long can the viewer really enjoy watching the characters move into the house before something spooky happens? Probably not very long. And when you introduce the other element, you introduce the disruption, that typically also introduces the genre elements, for example, horror elements or fantasy elements. And so delaying that out can result in tedium or boredom. It doesn't necessarily satisfy what the reader or the viewer was there to experience. So that's another reason why the conflicts might not be compelling, even if you can create them, because often you could come up with the way to add a conflict. You could come up with some conflicts to pad out the beginning of, say, The Conjuring or Insidious or a film of that type. However, keep in mind there's only so long you can keep the reader interested in sort of basic mundane situations or ideas. There's only so long the reader's going to be interested in the haunted house before the haunted house part starts happening. Yeah, we could add more conflicts. We could brainstorm things that could happen in The Conjuring. Maybe we could build more tension between the parents or between the kids. But it really gets into why. Why would we do that? What would be the benefit? Does it really add anything to the story? And so that's what you really want to be careful with when you're determining how long you're going to linger in the setup is, can you really create conflicts that are compelling? And is that genuinely necessary? Is it really necessary to set up a longer status quo? Or to linger longer in the status quo? Is there enough to set up that that's necessary? So be careful with that when you're working on your book, because a common issue is lingering too long in a status quo that really just isn't complicated, isn't hard to understand. Like in the case with Elliot and E.T., it just doesn't need more. It really just doesn't need much setup at all. So be mindful of that. It will help you a lot in determining how long you want to spend on the status quo. It's also important to note that all of this setup doesn't have to happen before the disruption of the status quo. In most cases, your character's not going to completely leave the situation that they're in once the status quo is disrupted. That can sometimes be the case. It's usually not the case. So if your character's not falling into a portal or getting shipped off to a boarding school somewhere, they're probably still going to be interacting with the same people, the same characters, etc., after their status quo is disrupted. So a good example of this is Juno. In Juno, she finds out that she's pregnant very early, practically at the very, very beginning of the film. And we don't really meet her characters. We don't really meet her family, her friends, the school, things like that, until after her status quo is disrupted. So keep in mind, you can set up the novel after the status quo is disrupted. You're not forced to just cram everything into the very, very, very beginning setup. So I think that can be, believing that the entire setup has to occur before the disruption of the status quo can sometimes be the reason that status quos can be bloated or last for too long. You also have to be mindful of that route being a potential solution if you're facing a problem of the setup scenes maybe feeling too much like setup, like it's too obvious that you're just setting things up, it's too obvious that you're just laying out the facts and the information you want the reader to know. Often in that case, those stories are good candidates for an earlier disruption of the status quo, and then those setup elements can continue as the character is coping with the disruption of the status quo. And that's a section of the novel that we're really going to talk about in the next video, but I just want to touch on that briefly here. When it comes down to what should it happen during the status quo or what you should include in the status quo, the important factor to remember is that the status quo conflicts explain why the character gets involved in the core or the main storyline. So, for example, in Squid Game, which is a very good example of this, the setup conflicts are related to the character's willingness to gamble, his financial difficulties, why he's trying to get more money. And that helps to explain and justify why he agrees to participate in the Squid Games. So that's an element that's absolutely crucial to the status quo, is establishing why a character would get involved in the core storyline. That's why I mentioned earlier with mundane storylines, the point of a mundane status quo, not a mundane storyline, sorry, why I mentioned previously a mundane status quo is that it creates a contrast and justifies the interest and involvement in something that's highly unusual. So a very mundane, boring life could lead someone to be more attracted to participating in something highly unusual or exciting. So even when the status quo is very, very short and a simple mundane explanation of what's occurring, it still justifies why the character ultimately gets involved in the core storyline. Another example of this is in Disney's Soul. We see Joe, he's offered a job teaching, but his dream is really to be a jazz musician, and he tries to get this gig, and he's finally going to get this big break, and he's going to be able to play with a jazz band, and then his status quo is disrupted when he dies. We know why he's so desperate to get back to life and to reconnect with his body, to be able to play this jazz gig, because that was his dream, and that's what we established during his conflicts in the setup. Another example, briefly, because I think this is an interesting example, is in Hocus Pocus. Like I mentioned, we see Max meeting Allison as a positive experience for him. So he doesn't like the town, he's unhappy, he's having a bad day. He meets Allison. She's sort of a breath of fresh air. His desire to sort of latch on to that good thing and that positive thing in the town is what leads him to agree to go with her to the Sanderson sister house, which is what sort of sparks the entire plot of the novel. So it doesn't necessarily have to be obvious in the most overt sense why this conflict led to their involvement in the main storyline, but it's definitely something that's present and something that you can see when you look for it. So the last point that I want to make about the status quo is to keep the character active. Make sure that they're not just sitting around doing nothing. They should be working towards something or trying to accomplish something. It's best and easiest for readers and viewers of films to empathize with characters when we see them actively trying and striving to achieve something or to improve their situation. So, for example, in The Shining, we meet Jack Torrance when he's trying to get a new job. He's trying to get the job at the Overlook Hotel. He's not just sitting around being an alcoholic or wishing that his family appreciated him more. We see him striving to sort of redeem himself and to improve his situation. And again, in Soul, we see Joe trying to get his gig, his jazz gig. He's taking action. He's trying to change his situation. It's very important to show the character being active and working towards something. There is one exception to the character being active, and that is that sometimes the point of the status quo is that the character isn't being active. They're not willing to engage in what they need to engage in order to sort of better themselves or improve their situation. So a good example of this is the Babadook. In the status quo, we don't really see her taking a lot of actions. Her son is having behavioral problems. We don't really see her doing a lot to solve that. And we don't really see her doing a lot in general. But we do see, and we should see in this case, how her failure to take action is hurting herself and the people around her. So sometimes the point is that the character isn't taking action yet, and that's something that they'll need to overcome and something they'll need to work on over the course of the novel, and that's what we see with the Babadook. So that's an exception, but it is not typical. So if you do go that route, there should be a reason, and the reason should be there should be a reason if the character is inactive, and that reason should be that really demonstrates an important factor in what they need to overcome emotionally throughout the story. So lastly, now I want to go over why you might not open with the status quo. So why a film or a novel might not start with the status quo. Note the status quo will still be there. It is not this isn't replacing the status quo, but when you might start with a prologue essentially, rather than just starting with the current storyline status quo. So there are a few main reasons that this tends to happen. The first reason is that necessary information wouldn't enter the story soon enough, or there'd be no natural way to introduce information into the storyline. So perhaps if you don't use the prologue, you would have to have a weird info dump or a weird conversation between two characters, sort of an as you know Bob conversation where things are discussed. Or it might even be the case that the character doesn't know the information yet, but the information still needs to be in the story earlier. So that's one reason you might start with a prologue. Another reason might be to raise anticipation for the disruption of the status quo. So the prologue may hint or give sort of glimpses or glimmers of what's going to come later on when the status quo actually is disrupted. And that might be done to compensate for a status quo that might be a little bit long or a little bit slow or boring, or maybe doesn't quite have the elements that the reader or viewer would want. And the last reason, which is probably the most common reason, maybe, is that genre elements wouldn't enter the story soon enough if you didn't have a prologue. So this is really, really, really common in horror. It's also really common in fantasy. Especially those that are set in sort of the ordinary, regular world, where the disruption of the status quo involves injecting fantasy or horror elements into the story, but that doesn't happen right at the very beginning. So you have a setup, you have a status quo that maybe needs to last a little bit longer, but throughout that status quo, we're not really going to be seeing the fantasy elements or the horror elements. So rather than just have those things enter the story late, a prologue allows the reader or the viewer to still get the tone and the vibe and the genre introduced at the beginning. So an example of this would be Gremlins. Gremlins, like we talked about, it has Billy's bad day, his horrible day at work, before he gets the gizmo, the gremlin. But the film actually starts with his dad buying the gremlin. That gets that fantasy element in. It gets some of the information, like we get the rules. So it kind of gives us a glimpse and a glimmer of what that disruption is going to be. We can kind of infer the problem that's going to be caused is going to be related to these rules that we're getting for how this gremlin works. So it gives us a sense of what we can expect, and it gives us a bit of fantasy element. So then when we go into the ordinary, regular world that Billy is struggling in, he's having his really bad day at the bank, we don't have to rely on that as the hook, because it's really not a very good hook, especially for children and families. You want something that's more exciting and interesting to really pull them into the story. Hocus Pocus is another really good example of this. The opening scene has the witches interacting with Thackeray, who's trying to save his sister. He gets turned into a cat. It's a very whimsical fantasy element, and that really helps to pull the reader or the viewer into the story and get through that more boring first day of school setup phase, which might not be that interesting for younger kids. And it also doesn't really have that fantasy element. So the fantasy element would enter quite late if that prologue wasn't included. So those are the reasons why you might want to include a prologue. I do want to talk about two other prologue type structures. One would be a flashback. So even though we're talking about a prologue, I would consider this to be a flashback because it primarily occurs before the core storyline. A good example of this would be the Babadook. In the Babadook, the first scene is the car crash where her husband dies, and we really establish her flaw, her sort of emotional core. And that's very common with this flashback structure, is that it would sort of establish the emotional basis of the film or the story or the novel. So we meet her during this car crash, this big cataclysmic event, and that's really what forms the basis of her flaw and her character arc through the novel, is her needing to deal with that grief and what occurred. So that is very common with the flashback structure, is that it's a flashback to the origin of the flaw or the thing that caused the emotional context or the emotional problem of the story. You also sometimes have stories that start with a flash forward. Deadpool is a good example of this. It opens with a big fight sequence, and again, this is really done to buffer out the fact that that more exciting superhero element wouldn't really enter the story early on if not for that. So because it's an origin story for Deadpool, there's a lot of things that need to be set up and established, and it wouldn't necessarily be super exciting for the viewer who really just came for the superhero and the more exciting action-y part. So that lets us know what we're going to expect, and it helps to pull us through the potentially more boring status quo. So that is all I have for you today. I really hope that you found this video helpful. I'm really excited to keep moving forward with this series. That said, the next video is going to be one of the writer types. I have two types left to cover, methodological plotter and intuitive pantser. Please let me know in the comments if you have a preference of which of those videos I prioritize for the very next video that I upload. Thank you so much to my Patreon supporters. It really means so much to me that you are helping support this channel. If you're interested in supporting on Patreon, I will be doing a Q&A there once a month. This month, January, is the first Q&A, so if that interests you, the link will be in the description. So I will see you all again soon. Let me know what questions you have. I'm happy to make a follow-up video if there are things I didn't cover about the status quo, or if you're still confused about anything, please just let me know. I'm always happy to make follow-up videos. So in the meantime, happy writing, guys.